You are co-authors on this book, which I thought was pretty unique. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I find that's fascinating to me.
Everybody loves to hear about the fact that we co-authored, and they're like, how do you do that? Like, how does it work? And it's it makes me laugh because I look at folks, like yourselves who are writing solo. I'm like, how are you writing like all by yourself? Like, who do you talk to? Like, how do you do this? So
Greetings and welcome to the Creative Writing Wizard podcast, where we chat with published authors to learn more about them, their books, and their writing process. Today, I am joined by published authors Courtney and Clarke Collins. Welcome to the podcast.
thank you for having us.
Indeed. Yeah. So for those listening in, I guess guys could take turns because there's two of you. Can you tell us a little bit about yourselves?
I'm Courtney Collins, and Clarke and I live in Vermont. We just got dumped with about a foot of snow, and it's extremely cold. And given that this is recording in February, we're all extremely tired of winter at this point. That being said, I would say by day, I work at our law school. I am not a lawyer. I just work for them. And I work in our environmental programs, as a matter of fact. So I like to think of it as like helping the people who are helping to make the laws that will save our planet. So that's great. And by night, I do burlesque dancing on occasion. Although, to be honest with you, that's taken a little bit of a backseat with all of the publication madness that's been going on.
Indeed. How about you, Clarke?
Yeah, I'm Clarke Collins. I also live in Vermont, as chance would have it. But no, I by day, I work for the man. I work for the government. It's at least at the state level. So I'm in the state government. We're in one of the good states. So, so it's not as terrible as it seems. But I oversee benefits and trying to make healthcare affordable for people. So I feel like I'm putting up the good fight. And when I'm not at work, I'm a big video gamer and tabletop role playing. I'm a big fan of D&D and such, and just try to escape the world that's around us. Really, is what I try to do.
Yeah, I hear that, and it sounds like both of you have in your day jobs a little bit of something that you're trying to do or be a part of that makes a difference in that. Like, so that we have the books to escape and have that, fantasy and other world, but then there's the real world that you're, having an impact on. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. And I feel like Clarke and I have always been kind of drawn to activism, I guess, in that sense of wanting to either help other people or leave the world better than when you found it. It's like when you go camping, they're like, leave the site in better condition than when you got there even. So that kind of mentality. So that being said, we're in our 40s. We're very tired, but we're trying. So, put that on my gravestone. She was tired, but trying.
That's funny. Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned the snow too there as well, because so I'm Canadian, and snow is just part of everyday life, along with riding a moose to work, as the joke as the joke goes. Yeah, so it's interesting. I guess the question for you, which I've always wanted to ask someone from your area, is what is cold in your opinion, quote unquote?
Okay, no, that's fair. That's fair. So today was like a high of low to mid teens, and tonight is a low of 0.
And
so that's not
Fahrenheit
as cold in Fahrenheit. Yeah, let's be clear for our listeners, for our international listeners. This is Fahrenheit, but it's not as cold as it's been. But this is still, listen, I am a delicate flower. This is a little much for me. But you said you're in Canada, and we are about, I would say, Clarke, would you say like 2 hours from the border?
Yep.
2 hours?
Yep.
So it's not like a lot of folks in this area, like we'll go up to Montreal for like a weekend, right? Like we'll go spend a weekend up there. Will you be our emotional support Canadian, Glenn? Will you do that for us, please?
Yeah, it's definitely.
Please, we beg.
Yeah, it's one of my services, like shine a spotlight for authors and have the indie release radar, and also, Canadian emotional support person.
Emotional support Canadian. Take all my money. You're hired.
Yeah, it's funny though, because you mentioned the Fahrenheit and Celsius. The funny thing about right now is that the temperature here in Canada is the same across both, because it's -40, and you don't have to say if it's Fahrenheit or Celsius, because it happens to be the same in both. So I always like to ask that question of what is cold, because I always get an interesting response there.
That's cold.
Yeah, indeed. It's a little chilly. It's not shorts weather. You have to put like shoes and maybe some long pants on. Yeah. But let's dive a little bit into your background here. So you talk about working with lawyers, talking about working with the government. How did each of you get into writing, and like what was it about writing that you really led you to starting this book?
Well, my path for writing started as a child because I grew up in a very small town and our house was 2 doors down from the local library. Otherwise, I was fairly surrounded by fields and forests. So to the library I went all day, every day as a kid. So reading was fundamental for me as long as I can remember. And I feel like that's like a really natural pathway into writing, is to have such a strong reading background. So I was the obnoxious child in elementary school who got excited when the teacher was like, you need to write a paper. I was like, yeah, I'm writing a story. Let's go. So I actually wanted to major in creative writing when I was in college because my intention was to be a writer. And then there was this requirement, you had to take like a year worth of poetry, and it killed any and all desire for me personally, as someone who appreciates poetry but cannot write poetry to save my life. So that ended that. But at the same time, it was when Clarke and I were in college where we met, when we very, very first started the very first inklings of this story, In the Name of Honor, which is the one that's now recently published. So for me, it's been lifelong.
Yeah, and I have a relatively similar path in that I was an avid reader. When I was very young, my mom showed me their entire bookshelf and said, pick something out to read. I had no limitations for any of the books that she had. So I read everything from Tolkien to Stephen King. At the ripe age of 10, so maybe some inappropriate choices, but I absolutely loved reading, and I devoured books, and that continued pretty much my entire life. And I saw reading and art, drawing as a way of, creative escapism, and really just sort of, finding a place to go to where my imagination can run wild. And I really didn't write all that much. I mean, maybe dabbled here and there in a little story or something like that, but nothing actually serious writing until, as Courtney was indicating, in college. And it was when I was studying abroad in Germany. I was lucky enough to get into a study abroad program. And when I was out there, I was the only one. It wasn't part of my school, so I knew basically no one in the entire world around me when I was in Germany. And just one day when, and this is when, to date myself entirely, this is when email was kind of a new fancy thing. Courtney and I were, keeping in touch that way. And just for whatever reason, the one day I sat down and I just started off, and honestly, not necessarily the first line, but the starting of the story really hasn't changed a whole bunch. The name of the main character is still the same as when we were in college, and I just wrote that first, I don't know, it's probably 2 or 3 paragraphs, but it was just the start of a story, and it went back and forth between us, and eventually started becoming something. Over time we could actually see, this could actually be something. So that's what sort of just led me into my writing.
That's awesome, and I guess it's a good thing to point out is that you are co-authors on this book, which I thought was pretty unique. I've met with a number of authors now, but usually from the stories I've heard thus far, it's single person writing their book, maybe having some editor input. Yeah, can you talk a little bit about that? Because I find that's fascinating to me.
Everybody loves to hear about the fact that we co-authored, and they're like, how do you do that? Like, how does it work? And it's it makes me laugh because I look at folks, like yourselves who are writing solo. Most folks do, right? And I'm like, how are you writing like all by yourself? Like, who do you talk to? Like, how do you do this? So I would say being a co-author is the best thing in the world, because you have somebody who is just as into your world, your characters, your situations with the story, who knows and understands your characters as intimately as you do, and who is just as excited to just gush and speculate and plot and talk about the story, which is your story, but our story. Does that make sense? Like, so something that is so dear to you is also just as dear to somebody else. And I think that's awesome. So we have a lifetime of just unbelievable amount of conversations around this world. And it's so thrilling, right? Like, if you imagine like a reader, a fan who comes up and is like, "Oh my gosh, I love this part when like this happens." And it gives you this jolt in your body, like this electric kind of like thrill of, "Oh my gosh, somebody else loves the story." And I have that every day, all day. Do you know what I'm saying? So, I guess emotionally it's badass. I love it. But let me hand it over to my co-author and see what he has to say.
Yeah, no, it's ditto on everything that Courtney said. I would say the other sort of key advantage to it is that, I think that we write relatively similar. We have a similar voice in the way that we write, but we also, there are certain things that are a real strength of mine. There's a certain things that's a real strength of Courtney's, and the two mesh perfectly. It's not like we're fighting over, there's an action scene and I would write it this way, but I would write it this way, and we have to try and force it together. I mean, really, our styles and what we, really are able to capture well just mesh together so well. So it's, it has never been a contention. There's maybe been a few scenes here and there.
Oh, there's maybe a few.
we distinctly say, that's not what I would have written, and we try and, rewrite it. But I would say in general, it's been so smooth. It has not been a difficulty at all.
Can I say one thing about that though? I'm going to disagree. You had said that you feel like our writing styles are similar. I don't think they are. I feel like your pieces, Clarke, stand out to me as having a different type of shape to them. I think what you're getting at is that with the way we swap what we write and go back and forth with it, I end up massaging enough of what you write that my voice then bleeds into it, and likewise you with what I write. So I think there becomes this blend, but I don't know. I kind of feel like there's like certain scenes or certain moments where like if you write versus like when I write, it's different. But overall, it all kind of blends together enough that hopefully readers don't see it as like two distinct voices, but instead it's one. And that's the feedback we've gotten mostly so far. So I think we've accomplished that.
Yeah, I could definitely say from my perspective, going in knowing that there's two authors, there was a part of my brain that was looking for, okay, maybe this is one author versus the other writing this part. I honestly couldn't tell. Like it was so smooth, and if you did do chunks that like transitions were smooth, or if you did do it together, it was like, yeah, it was one cohesive story where, I've seen there was another author that I saw that they did do co-authoring, but where they did is they split up the chapters. So each chapter was a different author essentially. And then they would switch back and forth, and you could tell the difference. it kind of played well for that book because each voice was a different character, so it's different vibes. But I guess the question to both of you is, how did you break up the work? Like, did you like have a process, or was it like was it the pantser winging it and seeing what happens kind of methodology?
It's a really good question. And to be honest with you, I feel like we can only talk about the more recent work because the original work goes back so long ago, like so long ago. We were not in college yesterday. Okay, my friend, it has been a while. There was dial-up involved. Let's leave it at that. So I don't like recall the early stages of drafting what that was. I no longer, that's lost to time. Maybe Clarke remembers though. His memory is far superior to mine. But I will say in perhaps like the final iterations of the story before it went to print, we had the story finished for so long. I jumped in and did a lot of the editing before it went to our publishing house and then did multiple rounds with the editors there. But I did a lot of like the editing cleanup with the story because we had one of our beta readers suggest to us in an earlier draft, and they were like, you really need to do some editing on this, which was the best thing that anybody has ever said to me. Because I was like, I was new. I didn't know what I was doing. So I was like, editing, what is that? Let's go to Google. How do I edit? And it was this whole world unlocked for me in a way that really scratches an itch in my brain, right? Where I'm like, if you do X, your sentence structure is stronger. If you do Y, your descriptions are more lush. So I was all about the formulas, right? So I did a lot of that. And maybe it makes sense to talk more about, to answer your question, the sequel, which we did draft and revise over the past couple years. And so let's talk about that. So the sequel, In the Name of Pride, we drafted and revised that over the past 2 years. I'm going to say 2. Listen, time has no meaning in this post-apocalyptic world, truly. And that was more of what you were just describing, Glenn, where I tended to take a lot of Kalila's chapters, the main female character, and Clarke took a lot of Dimitar's chapters, the main male character. And so there was more of a delineation that way. Clarke also took the villains chapter, took the lead on that, and I think established that voice more. So there was more, and then like as we went along in the story, it was like, hey, these next few chapters, X needs to happen. And I would be like, oh, I really want to write that. Or Clarke would say that. So then we would shift back and forth that way.
Yeah, and and I think a lot of it too is just a vibe check. Sometimes it's not, it's not that Dimitar is mine because I'm a guy. Like it's not like that at all. It's more just, we found, we were amused at one point to realize how much of ourselves we write into some of the characters. So it's not necessarily that it's because Dimitar is the male lead character that I write him. It's more just like I've written so much of myself into him unknowingly, or at least not intentionally, that sometimes I have the voice better. And there's certain other characters that, that Courtney just has that voice, they can really capture that character. And then there are times that it's just a vibe check, it's just this scene is coming up and it's something that, Courtney has always wanted to write, or I've always wanted to write, like that scene that's in your head that you just can't wait to get to it when you're writing the story. And you just pass it off and, let the person have at it. So, I wouldn't say that it's like a formal, we switch every other chapter or anything along those lines. It just sort of flows, whatever feels like the right person to handle that section of the story, that's who writes it.
That's awesome. Yeah. And, I guess to that point, you mentioned at least 2 so far and a third, point of view that you've written from. One of the things I thought that was cool was, I'm not going to say who specifically for spoiler's sake, but you do go through more than just those 2, main character perspectives. How did you decide, or did you decide, or was it kind of a happenstance, on which characters to write from in terms of perspectives?
That's such a great question. And to be perfectly honest with you, the answer is it happened because of a really bad habit. And that bad habit was head hopping. So before we really knew anything about craft, we were just dumping the story from our heads to page. And it wasn't quite a third omniscient point of view, right? Where you can be in everybody's head. So it was head hopping. And I, again, not knowing anything, didn't realize that was a thing until it was pointed out. And then I was like, oh, what's the problem here? And I learned about why that's so problematic. And I learned about why doing a closer, deeper third point of view is arguably preferred, perhaps, or at least, the direction that we wanted to go. So we had to do a lot of revision with this first book to hone the point of view so that we were not head hopping and that we had a distinct voice and driver for each chapter. And so that was, I remember, Clark, I remember plotting that out. Some color coding was involved on a scrap of paper, like true professionals, to figure out, okay, this should be Dimitar, this should be Kalila, this should be Khalid's point of view. This chapter could go either way, Dimitar or Kalila. Well, how many chapters does Dimitar have? Oh, you know what? I think we should have Kalila. Kalila needs some more airtime, so let's give it to her. So there was like a method to it once we got to it, but it was really just a matter of breaking the bad habits. Sorry.
Yeah. And, in a couple of the, we really tried not to have like one-off chapters because, those can be pretty disruptive to just suddenly have a chapter through a random character. That being said, there were some chapters that originally we had head hopping or along those lines that we just decided, to change it to one of the main characters would either remove the chapter entirely, which we weren't willing to do, or would change it so much that it just wouldn't have the same impact. So, there are a couple times when we switch to, someone who's not one of the main point, not Dimitar or Kalila. And those chapters in particular, it just didn't make any sense to switch to one of their points of view. So, we try our best not to, make it too crazy, because I know there's a lot of readers that are not a fan of 100 different points of view, but I think we kept it to the right number.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. As the reader, I thought that it was cool that you showed the majority through those two perspectives. But the times that you did switch to a non-main character or the supporting cast, I thought really added to the story to give that extra perspective, and to help flesh out like why it's important that that character is doing something. So I think you hit the mark on that point. So good job there, and I guess thanks to the people who gave the feedback. I guess the question for you, and you've mentioned a number of things. One is around the publishing aspect. So you do have a publisher of a form, and I guess the question to you is, what does that look like from your perspective, and how has that process been? And my understanding, and feel free to correct me, is that it's let's say not the big five, but the like a small press or an indie press that you've been working with.
Yes, it's a small independent press, and I will suggest that perhaps I can go over some of the cons, and perhaps Clark can go over some of the pros. So, because you want to lead with the negative and then end with a positive. So, I will say, it was important to us to work with either an agent or a publisher directly. That was just the vision that Clark and I always had for our story. And so we landed with Shadow Spark Publishing. They are a small independent publisher who has been in the industry for coming up on 6 years now. And they have a a decent catalog of titles, primarily in like the fantasy, sci-fi, horror genre. And so that fit with us. And I will say that my experience so far has been what I imagine to be essentially what self-publishing is. And I think it's because the publisher is so small and so actively hands off, if that makes sense, that I think all the movement has to come from us as the authors. So that means, the marketing and the promotion absolutely being the largest piece of that, like hands down. And so neither Clarke nor I have marketing background, and that's a real learning curve, right? Like you got to learn about it. You got to make time for it. You need to work on getting somewhat decent on it, and I'm also not a designer. Graphics are a huge thing. I have struggled endlessly until I finally upgraded my Canva account to Pro reluctantly, but boy, it has made a positive difference in my life. And so it's left me with feeling like, okay, well, we have a publisher that took us on for the trilogy, and that feels really good. And I want to play in the big leagues, but I'm not in the big leagues. But I think, on the other hand, that could set Clarke and I up for being big fish in a small pond. Is this too many analogies today? I just realized I probably just used like 10 analogies there.
Yeah, I know, and it's I do agree. I think we originally wanted to go to the more traditional publishing route, one of the big five, and in the query trenches, as they're called, and ended up with the small press. And I think, to me, the major advantage of a small press is that, for all intents and purposes, we still are in control of our book, meaning that we do not have someone coming down and saying, Dimitar should be a woman, or some other character. This is too many characters. Get rid of this character. We don't have that big five publisher coming down to us to tell us how to write our story. They didn't tell us what the cover art needs to look like. They didn't tell us, so there was a lot of freedom and control that we still had over our story that I think you lose when you go that traditional publishing route. So I do definitely appreciate the fact that, essentially, for all intents and purposes, they signed us and they published it. Everything else, all the other choices have been our own. So I really do put a lot of value in the fact that I still feel a lot of ownership over our story.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned on both those fronts of, how it can be helpful to have, the indie publisher to help support you. But the thing that I've been learning, and I feel like other people as well don't really understand or know about, is how a lot of these publishers, they do still expect you to do marketing, to do advertising.
Yeah.
And even, like, I've heard stories of even people in the big five, or have signed with the big five, do have to do their own marketing, building their own social platforms. How have you found that side of the experience? So you've written, your work, you're getting it published, and then now you're trying to get it out into the world.
Oh, it's like losing my mind. It's like going crazy on a daily basis because it's so time consuming. It is a full-time job. And I have a full-time job. And on top of my full-time job, I have nighttime activities. And on top of nighttime activities, I have some children I need to raise to be decent human beings, and so on and so forth, right? The marketing piece is a full-time job. And if that's not something you're adept at, or like I was saying, that you're, have learned, you got to learn all of it on the fly too. And so I spent this past year throwing myself into every social media. I'm on social media all the time. I can't stand it because I don't like my face in a screen constantly. And that's how I feel I am. And I will say part of that is driven by my intense FOMO, right? Like if I'm not online, I'm going to miss out on something, like God forbid. So, okay, perhaps that's something I need to work on. But I also think it's important to be online and present to promote your book, to engage with people who might be interested in your book, and to engage with colleagues, with other writers, with other authors, because the community that you have as someone who is an author is invaluable, right? Assuming you're connecting with the right people, and I think most people are the right people, it's been invaluable. The connections that I've made just for the sheer support that you get. And now on top of that, I think it's important to be online for accessibility reasons for people, which is why, I don't know, one of the pieces of advice that I heard was like, just pick like 2-3 tops social media platforms, dedicate yourself to that, and that's it. So you're not going crazy the way I am with a million different social media platforms. And I decided to disregard that advice because, you know, the person who is on Instagram might not be on Threads, but there's people on Threads, but they might not be on Blue Sky, but there's people who are on Blue Sky who are not. So, you know, I don't know. I like to cast a wide net. Let's put it that way. I wish it didn't take up too much time. If I win the lottery, I would hire a personal assistant to manage this stuff. That would be my dream. Clark has gotten out of my way because he knows how type A I am, and I need to just drive everything. So Clark's role in all of this, and I'll let you speak for yourself, my love, but his role is to calm me down when I get too overwhelmed and stressed out about this stuff. But otherwise, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to say that I sit back and reap the benefits, but it's true. You know, I am there. I am there for the moral support. I am there for the hype, and you know, to run ideas by. But frankly, you know, that rarely happens. Courtney she won't say it herself, but I will. I think she's done an absolutely brilliant job. You know, I would say it's so much better than I've seen almost from everyone else that I know of in this sort of self-publishing or in, you know, small press publishing realm. So I think she's done a fantastic job. And I think because of that, I think we've seen, you know, a lot of the impact coming back to us. You know, when we look at other self-published writers, or again the other, even the other writers of our publishing house, you know, the numbers that we're seeing and the engagement that I'm seeing is astronomical compared to a lot of the others. So it definitely pays off. You know, we'll see if it pays off in terms of books sold and whatnot, but in terms of engagement, in terms of, you know, people coming to us and engaging with us as authors, I really feel like, you know, her efforts have bared some fruit. So, yeah, but I recognize that it's incredibly difficult. You know, even for the, like you were saying, even for the people that are in the top 5, you know, published traditionally, you know, still finding a voice in this, you know, hellish void of the internet is so difficult. You know, there's so many voices out there. There's so many people in the same situation as us that it's really hard to find your audience. But, you know, I think Courtney has really given it the best effort possible.
But I will also say that since having this book published 3 weeks ago, we're now starting to see the benefits of the work that's gone into curating space online and hopefully finding readers and other writers who are interested in this type of story. And I think it makes it worth everything. So for example, just today over on Instagram, we were tagged in someone's post who was showing our unbelievably amazing cover and was like, and her post was to the extent of, you know, she had read a digital ARC copy, and she was like, I read the ARC copy and I absolutely had to have a physical copy as well. Thank goodness for like next day Amazon shipping. And I was like, this person just overnighted our book. What? Like that's, and I don't know if I can explain. Listen, birthing 2 children from my body was a pretty great experience. But when I tell you the feeling I get from someone tagging me online holding up our book, ooh, the best feeling.
we had someone, I mean, we had someone do fan art, like unsolicited
Oh
fan
my
art.
God, yes, last week fan art.
Yeah, and well, not only fan art, but it was amazing fan art. Like
really
it wasn't
good.
even like a 4-year-old sketch. This was a very talented
So good.
artist. So I mean that's so cool.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, Courtney, that you've been doing this yourself, and you say, it's something that you need to work on. Like, I'll echo, what Clark's saying is, you're doing a really good job. I was going back through your recent Instagram posts, and like they are on point. So like, whatever you're doing good. Keep doing it, and
Thank you.
Keep
Well,
going.
you know what? I learned from people like you. If we're going to talk about success, Glenn, we got to turn this conversation around and talk about you. And talk about you, Glenn, who has launched himself into the stratosphere of indie published authors and authors in general. Just truly beloved. Threads, Instagram, your followers are very impressive.
Indeed, yeah, and I won't spend too much time talking about me because it's a podcast about y'all and your book. But yeah, it's been interesting to ride the roller coaster and the wave of interest. There's I think you've touched on a number of points, but there's so much need here. I find, like, of authors who spent hundreds of hours on their books and then trying to get it out to people, and just not quite getting there, or not getting, the amount of people or even the right people to find their books. So it's like, there's the wins and the positive stories, like you mentioned, Clark, of people creating fan art. That's amazing. And then, but for me, it's like the other side of the story of people who are, how do they say, shouting into the void. And it's like, I really have a heart for people like that, because I've created stuff. And if I created something that I believe in, I love, and I shared it, and then no one, engages with it, that's just heartbreaking. So
Yeah.
a lot of what I've been doing recently is like, there's stuff that I can do that'll help people to be seen. So it's like, this podcast is one of the ways, and the Indie Release Radar is another. But I don't want to go too much on about what I'm working on, because this is a podcast for you guys to talk about your books. But I guess the one thing I will ask, though, is what have you found that has worked well? So like there's certainly the struggle of marketing and social media management, and there's so many platforms. But what have you found that has worked well?
What has worked well? I almost want Clark's, like, perhaps more objective perspective to be like, hey, that worked. Okay, well, I hate to give this answer because it pains me personally, but I think regular engagement, regular posting, regular presence, regular commenting with folks. I think if you walk away from social media for a while, that the algorithm will tank you. It's not your fault. It's how the game is set up. Do you know what I mean? So I feel like we've had some steady growth because I've been regularly engaging. And by regular engaging, to me, it feels like nonstop engaging, which is why I'm losing my mind. But I think regular engagement makes a difference. Here's a pro tip for the listeners. One thing that I found to make a significant difference is having a group of people who will automatically engage with your post, be it liking, commenting, sharing, reposting, quote reposting, whatever the case may be. And so I would advise folks setting up some type of group situation. And in our case, I have a couple group DMs where there's, for me, it's mostly our fellow authors who are in this group. We also have a street team that we set up last fall. And so we have a small group of readers as well. Small yet powerful, small yet mighty. We refer to them as our fellowship. And so I know that when I post something, I can let them know and be like, hey, here's today's post about our launch event this weekend. Give it a boost. However you want to boost it, please boost it. And then people will do that. And then I, in turn, will do the same for them. And so that happens near every day. And so that, you know what, if we're going to play a game, that's how you can trick the algorithm, I think, to engage more, is to have people that you know who are going to engage with you regularly.
Yeah, I can definitely echo that. And I guess for people listening in or watching, if you want to support authors, you don't even necessarily have to buy their books, which you should, and this is a book that you should buy. But if you want to support authors, like liking, commenting, and reposting, it's really amazing, because I work in data and data analytics for like my real world job. It's amazing how much difference one comment can make on a post or one repost. And like for effort wise, you could say as little as cool, and that's it.
Yeah.
Just that little bit of effort can like launch that comment or that post into like a whole other network, and then it'll just, waterfall from there. So definitely I can echo that. You mentioned on the term fellowship, which is awesome. And Clarke, you mentioned reading about Tolkien. I wonder, Clarke, if you could talk a little bit about the inspiration side of the story. So, we've talked about, how you've kind of worked together as co-authors, and how, that progression has led to the book. Can you talk a little bit more about, what inspired this specific story? And I guess with that maybe being a bit of a reach, talking about the second book that you're also working on at the moment.
Yeah, sure. So I'd say, the reason why Tolkien was such a big thing to me, and honestly, when I look back and I read and I tell, if I were to give my top 5 books of all time type of thing, I feel like the common theme through them, and something that really resonates with me, is and I'm going to say simple, but I don't mean simple as in not complex, but a simple version of heroes being heroes, villains being villains. That idea of there are good people. Well, to quote Sam, right? There are good things worth fighting for. And that has always been an inspiration to me. So Tolkien was he was very clear cut. These are the heroes. Those are the bad guys. There was never a gray in the middle. It was pretty clear cut who the heroes were and who the villains were. And those kind of stories have always resonated with me. And I'd say, of any inspiration, I mean, obviously, looking back at Tolkien, we have elves. We have a very, high fantasy. And, anytime you mention high fantasy, you kind of have to give credit to Tolkien, because he kind of created it. So to a certain extent, there's inspiration there, obviously. But I'd say the major inspiration that I draw from that and from my other favorite novels is just that idea of allowing your heroes to be heroic. Now, it doesn't mean that there can be nuance there, and they can have trauma, they can have, real things that they're dealing with.
Yeah.
But there's never a moment when you're reading it that you think, is Dimitar going to do something evil in this moment? Or no, that's not a question. He is heroic by nature. And I just really enjoy that. That's always been something that's really, and maybe that's just trying to escape the real world, because, especially over the last 5 or 6 years, really, so many of the people that, real world people, that people looked up to and called heroes, that we have found they're not, that they are bad people. When people that have been revealed in such a way, even, more recently with, some other authors. So, sometimes I just want my heroes to be heroes, and, being able to escape into that with what I'm writing, but also what I'm reading. Like they say, you write what you like to read. So I'd say that's been where I've driven pulled a lot of my inspiration from those stories is, it just that, that idea that, these are people that you can aspire to. These are people that hopefully inspire, the readers.
Awesome. How about you, Courtney?
Oh, geez. Okay. Well, now I have to tell you my deep, dark secret. Everyone listening, feel free to judge. I get it. Okay, I get it. I technically did not finish the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I'm sorry, I didn't. I would just, because on page it's just this wah, 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 wah description. And I was like, Return of the King. And finally, I set it down halfway through. I was like, I'm exhausted. I cannot. The movies, however, the movies got me pumped. The movies got me into it. The movies were a fantasy visual that I've always had in my head and was now in front of me as if it was real. And so if I think of any kind of Lord of the Rings comparison, which I don't, because I do not want the Tolkien bros to come after myself or my husband. Thank you, no. But if I think about it, I think about like the movies, and more specifically, I think about the Rings of Power show. Because that is more diversified than the original movies, which I love, and I do watch those movies annually, if not biannually. But like the show, I think the Rings of Power show is perhaps a more apt comparison to our book. I wanted to say, as much as Clarke loves to cheer for a hero, man, let me tell you, I have the deepest black hole in my heart. I will hold hate for a villain like you will not believe. That's on Taurus energy. But when I tell you, I want a villain that I can just wish for the most horrible things imaginable to happen to them, that brings me joy. That's what I love. So
That's awesome. Yeah, it's funny how each of us kind of draws different inspirations from stuff, and definitely no shade for not finishing the Lord of the Rings books.
Don't tell anyone. Yeah. Keep it between us.
Yeah, definitely not anyone as we're on recording. But I definitely I feel like sometimes I have like the rose tinted nostalgia glasses when I think about the books. But then when I actually read them, it's a different experience. Because I too have watched the movies, I've read the books. They're both great for different reasons. But yeah, if you may not enjoy both, I think that's totally fair. I guess outside of the Lord of the Rings, do you feel like there's any either books, movies, or media that really inspire you, like the dark black hole abyss type, hatred for villains that fuels you on, or in general?
Oh, no, I think that's just my personality, honestly. Oh, no, but also, you know what? One of the part of the beauty of being children from the 80s is, like Clarke was saying earlier, the supervision was at an all-time minimal. And so I too was actively reading Stephen King in, when I was 12, say. Like I was deep into it for my 7th grade book reports. I don't know if there's anything else other than I can tell you this. When I got into fantasy, when I really got into it, was when I was a teenager, and I was at our local bookstore at the time, and I picked up a copy of one of the Dragonlance books. Do you remember those? Are you familiar with those? Because now, once again, we are dating ourselves, but Dragonlance was a huge series back in the day. And boy, did that was like a drug. That hooked me. I was hooked. I had, I don't know how many copies of because the Dragonlance books was by Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weiss. And it was this huge series, just like an endless number of titles. And I ate them up. I ate them up like a meal, and I came back asking for more. And so that was a pretty big influence on me. It got me into fantasy, got me into the genre, and I have not left since.
That's awesome. Yeah, and you mentioned around how there is some Tolkien-esque aspects to this book. But there has been a few departures, from my opinion, from like a, I don't know, quote unquote high fantasy expected things. One of the examples being the goblins. I think that's a slightly different interpretation than I've experienced with other high fantasies. So the question that I have for you is, when you're developing, this universe, when did you decide, okay, this is when we want to, have this type of, race, and it kind of tends to follow these types of tropes or types of patterns, but in this case, we want to do something slightly different, or was there, more of a fluid, it just kind of happened that way?
I think it's somewhere. I think it's a combination. I think that when I started writing, or when we started writing this together, but even when it was just sending over a couple paragraphs over an email, that newfangled thing email, I felt like I was using terms because they were familiar to me, but not necessarily using them to mimic. So actually, I think your goblin is a perfect example. I wanted to use the term goblin because it's immediately familiar in the sense of, okay, this is going to be a creature that's going to have some nefarious intent, because that's what goblins typically are. But I also wanted to make them our own, to change the, what they look like, what they're capable of. We do that very similarly with the elves. I think we have a relatively unique spin on elves as well. So I feel like each of the creatures that share a name with something that is stereotypically high fantasy, I feel like we put our own little spin. But for the creatures, the corruptors, which are the main creatures as villains in our story, I really wanted to create something for that. I wanted to create something new. Something that was that that either hadn't been done before, or at least the name hasn't been used before, but it just genuinely come up with something original. So, I think it was just I think at first it might have just been goblin by default, because what else do you call a green monster, and then it just sort of but I wanted it to be a little something different than what has been done in the past when you hear the word goblin. So, I feel like I'm spinning my wheels on how to answer that. But, I feel like in general we tried to make it as unique, but also, ease people into our world by using terms that they've heard before.
Yeah, I dig that. And one of the other things I thought was really interesting in your book, there's a few times where you describe something, but you describe it in a detail where it seems like you know what you're talking about. And not to say, you don't know anything, but in fantasy you can kind of make stuff up. You can kind of do whatever you want. But there's two specific scenarios. One was archery and one was horse riding, and like the preparation of horses. And I think you mentioned in your acknowledgments that you had some input from other people. Do you come from an archery or horse riding background to have that detail? And like, what was the process of getting to, okay, this is something I want to describe in this universe. This is something that's important in terms of detail. What's the thought process behind that?
So I've done archery in the past. It's not as regular or as frequent as I would like. So I truly cannot call myself an archer. I would like to call myself an archer. Alas, I do not practice enough. But I have done it in the past. And I trained with someone who, an older gentleman who has since passed, but who was really top of his game and very involved in the local SCA. And so I spent a summer or two learning from him, and I don't remember a lot these days because the memory does not support me, but I do recall, some bits and pieces of the archery that I've done in the past. And I own a few bows. I have a target. I really just need to haul it out when it's not 0 degrees outside and start practicing some more. And then you're right, for the horses, I do not have experience with that, nor does Clark. But I had a coworker for a period of time when we were in final revisions for this, and I would lean back in my chair in my office and poke my head out the door, and I would say, I have a question, because she's someone who, I'm not sure if I don't remember if she rode so much herself as took care of the horses and knew a lot about horse behavior and taking care of them. And so I pulled from her a lot of like random last minute questions about horses that way. And so, yes, I did thank Molly Russell, thank you, in our acknowledgments for giving me that insight.
Yeah, the horse and the blacksmithing. We happen to have a friend that's a blacksmith as well. And it's great being able to run a scene by them and have them say, no, you really can't gallop for 5 days. Like, you're going to kill your horse. Like, they can do that for a couple hours maybe. Or, the whole blacksmithing process. We basically just said, hey, Keith, how does this work? And he walked us through, no, that'll break the steel, or that kind of thing. So we were able to, and it's it's a relatively small scene in the story, but everything that happens in that scene is how a blacksmith would actually forge a sword. And we tried to pull in realism where we could. Like you said, it's fantasy. We could do whatever the heck we wanted. The horses in our world, sure, maybe they can gallop for 6 days, but I think we wanted to ground it in a little bit of realism again, because it makes it feel familiar. It makes it feel realistic, even though it's in a fantasy world. And we really tried to pull that in as much as we could.
Can I share something else that we did? Okay, so our elven forest is the Sundine Forest, where the elves live, and there's forests across the land, but the elven Sundine Forest is special because it has potent, almost magical qualities to it that really vibe with the elves and their energy, if you will. And so to describe this forest, all of that came from when Clarke and I were living out in California on the West Coast. And there was one time where we were in the San Francisco Bay Area, and one weekend we went up to the North Bay where the John Muir Woods are, which are these huge redwood trees, these huge redwoods. This unbelievable Muir Woods forest. And we walked through it, and I very distinctly remember sitting down on a log at one point and pulling out a notepad and a pen and just writing down what I was seeing, what I was smelling, what I was hearing, what I was feeling, like, all those senses, right? And that pretty much word for word became the descriptions for our elven forest. And I really want to go back, I'm going to be honest.
That's awesome. Yeah, and as you guys, as you guys take off and become famous authors, then people will mark it on the map as like, this is where they wrote that scene, and people can visit it and like, oh my gosh, I'm in that.
Oh my god, perfect.
That's awesome. What would you say is like, so a lot of the audience is fellow authors, fellow writers. What would you say each of you has as far as like advice or things that you've learned along the way that you feel like would be helpful to share to others?
Learn how to edit. You are not too good to edit. You are not too good to edit. You need to learn how to edit your manuscript, unless you have a lot of wealth and you can just throw money at developmental editors, at copy editors to clean up your manuscript after the fact. But even if you did that, you're still not learning the craft. So I don't know why you wouldn't want to like have your craft be strong organically. Okay. So I say this as somebody who really could see how our writing transformed and elevated after applying a lot of the basic editing techniques. So for example, like kill your adverbs, kill your filter words. Filter words are like he saw, he felt, he thought, like get rid of that. This is of course assuming a third person point of view. I think it's a little different for omniscient, but even with omniscient, I think you want to tamp that down, because what you want to do is draw that reader into your story. You want to put them in it. You want them to feel like they are in that story. And a lot of that comes with editing. And so what I see, what I hear are a lot of authors who take this approach of like, rules are meant to be broken and there's a place for adverbs and I'm going to use them if I want to. And listen, we have adverbs in our story. Sure. We have some filter words. Sure. But they are minimal. They are there for a very specific reason, for a very passive language is another one, right? Like you want to get rid of all this stuff that distances your reader from your characters and being immersed in your story. And the way to do that is through editing. So I am team editing, and I think that people need to set aside that they're too special to follow that, because you're not, and your writing will be better. Your writing will be better if you can apply some of like the basic rules to your writing. And once you know the rules and understand them and use them, then you can think about breaking them on occasion. I could TED Talk this, Glenn. You better back me off this mic, because let me tell you.
So that'll be for part 2 of the podcast.
Nice. Yeah, and I think for me, honestly, it's I am not. I am, or at least very rarely, like an egotistical person. I am usually the opposite. I tend to, put myself down type of, that kind of.
Clarke is so humble, and I'm not at all. It's amazing.
Humble. There's the word. There's the word I was looking for. But I would say that it was really hard. And it took me a long time, and Courtney will absolutely corroborate on this. It took me a long time to put aside my ego when it came to criticism, when it came to people reading it and being like, this scene doesn't work. My initial instinct, especially when we were first going through the process of, okay, we're really striving to get this published now. A lot of the time, most of the time I would hear that kind of, comment. I would think that the reader was wrong. They're just not reading it right, or, they might say that, but I'm not going to change it anyway. When really it's taking, learning how to accept that, learning how to think about it. And I would say 99% of the time, what comes out of that self-reflection and rewriting is so much better. It's so much better. It's cleaner. It's more exciting. And that includes cutting whole chapters. We have a chapter that is still, if there's one contention about book 1, there's still one chapter that we cut, that I still really like, that we ended up cutting from the story. But even I can admit, and I'll admit this to the public, is that the story is better for having it cut. It's hard. I still look back on that and think, oh man, that's harsh. But, you really have to be able to, there's a craft to storytelling. And it's not just writing words down on a page. There really is a craft to it. And you just have to be willing to accept and reflect and come out better for it. And that's hard, because, especially with something that you're writing, especially when you get to a point that you can say the end on a novel, that is such a personal, intimate thing to you. So to have someone say, this part doesn't work, that's really hard to hear. But that would be my number one advice, to be honest, is just learning to hear that and grow from it, as opposed to hearing it and opposing it.
Can I add on to that and say what I suggest for people who are learning to take criticism, because I agree with Clarke that it's hard as hell, is to sit with it. Because people want to react in the moment when they receive something that's like, I don't understand this, or this doesn't work, or you should do this instead. And there is that defensiveness, right? Of like, they don't know what they're talking about. But if you sit with it, I think Clarke, what Clarke and I have found is probably, I'm going to say close to 9 times out of 10, it's actually good advice. Assuming the person you're getting advice from is also a fair critiquer, because I hear horror stories of people who critique in an atrocious way, and thankfully Clarke and I haven't had that. We've had excellent beta readers. So So assuming you have someone who means well and intends well for your story, just sit with the critique, take a breath, take a drink, and look at it the next day or two. And I think that it might actually be to your benefit. So I agree with you, Clarke.
Yeah, and and sometimes it's not even negative criticism, right? So, I'm saying criticism, but sometimes it's just, even if it's positive feedback, there are some things in our story that exist because people said, "Oh man, these two should really, people ship some characters together," or, as we've come to call him, the cheese thief, right? Cheese was such a minor thing.
Minor.
It was literally like a paragraph initially, but for whatever reason, all of the beta readers gravitated towards it, and it was, or one in particular, really pushed it. And we decided, you know what? Let's make this a thing. Let's, and it's, you have to be able to sort of organically. So even if it's positive comments, it's not even always negative. Some positive comments, you have to be able to say, all right, I had no idea that this character was going to be the fan favorite. If it's the fan favorite, let's lean into that. Let's elevate that. And, so you can grow in a positive way as well, but it's still just that ability to sit back, look at your story, hear comments, hear thoughts, and grow from it. I think that's probably my number one advice.
Yeah, no, I can definitely echo that. And I think definitely when I started writing, I used to take a lot of the feedback personally, like that it was like a personal attack of like that I'm not good or that, what I have to say isn't good. But it was fairly recently that one of the instructors of a course I was taking on writing gave me back a short story I had written, and it was covered in red ink. Like there's tons of stuff scratched out, tons of notes in the margin.
I would die, Glenn. I would die.
It looked brutal. But as she handed it to me, she said, "I want you to know I went so intense about it because I really enjoyed what you wrote, and I want it to be better. Like you have a really good story here, but it could be better. And I want you to do better. And like, this is like an encouraging thing." And it took me a bit to get to that place because I saw a lot of red. Definitely there's that element, and great advice about sitting with that. Cause that initial emotional reaction is so easy. Cause like we put so much of our heart into these stories, and for someone to say, it's just like, it can sting. So great advice there. And you've mentioned now that you've got the first book published. It's part of a trilogy. You've got a second book in progress, quote unquote. What's that looking like, and what's next for the both of you?
Yeah. I'll let Courtney hype it up, and I'll speak the more logistical side of things. So, book 2 is in the beta reader stage. So it has we didn't type the end because you don't do that until it's like the final. But essentially it's written. Book 2 is completed. It's a complete story, and we're sending out to beta readers right now. Book 3, we are, that's been a bit of a problem child. It's actually been harder to write than we anticipated, but we're still making some pretty good progress. It's about 30 to 40% done. We still have to dive in together. Courtney's attention has really been divided between marketing and hyping up book 1 and then editing book 2 because she does most of the editing as well. So the drafting has sort of been put to the wayside, or at least put on me, and and it's really the combo. We write together, so I think we'll come and we'll find that synergy, and we'll really make book 3 shine. We haven't had the chance yet to really do the combined forces, Power Ranger style. But yeah, so I'll let Courtney hype up book 2 though, because this is her darling, I think.
Okay, so book 2 is the best and most favorite thing I've ever written. And I say this with book 1, in the name of honor, is my whole heart walking out into the world, exposed to everybody to either take care of it or stab it. That being said, in the name of pride, which is book 2 in the Vows and Valor trilogy, is the best thing I've ever written. And I will say, I will credit our publisher for this, who said when we came on board with the trilogy contract, right? A contract for the trilogy. She was like, you don't have to spend time worrying about querying anymore. You can now take your querying time and put that towards writing. And it has been like a fire lit in you, right? Like, hey, I'm on a contract. These books are releasing annually. Book 2 comes out in 11 months now. So TikTok, princess, let's get it done. And I don't know what it is about book 2, because I think a fair number of authors have a book 2 writing slump, from what I've heard, where book 2 gives them a lot of problems. No, book 2 came out of me like a fire hydrant, just gushed out of me. And I think Clarke, same way with you too. And so it's very intimate. And I thought book 1 was intimate too, but boy, book 2 is intimate in a whole deeper way. So I'm very excited for it. It's a lot of emotional damage, which is great, I think, for the reader experience. I'm super excited for people to read that. And it's been tricky because I would say since this past fall, we've been juggling 3 manuscripts at the same time. We've been doing the edits with the house on book 1. We've been revising book 2 so it could be ready for beta readers, and we've been drafting book 3. And by we, I mean Clarke has been drafting book 3, because I was doing the revisions on book 2 while we were both trying to get the edits done for book 1. So it's been bananas in that way. But book 1 is now done. Book 2 is now done, at least until we get the beta feedback. So I'm about to now come into book 3 for the first time. And my struggle has been with feeling like book 2, In the Name of Pride, has brought me all the tropes and all the situations that are my most favorite. Like, here's my most favorite things, and I'm going to write about them all. And I feel like I did that in book 2. So I'm left with kind of feeling like, well, what am I going to bring to book 3? And of course, Clarke and I, we do a level of plotting to some extent. And we do some pantsing too. How do we get from point A to point B? Well, let's see what happens. So there's flexibility. But I would be lying if I didn't say I was a little apprehensive coming into book 3. That being said, it was pointed out to us by our publisher that the magic happens when Clarke and I write together. And up until now with book 3, it's been Clarke writing by himself. So first of all, crown yourself, my king, for like taking on drafting the first third of this book by yourself. But I think I do need to come in and now give it my touch and see if we can give it the same impact that I feel in my heart with book 2. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. What would you say is your preferred way for, either writers to reach out to you or readers as they get into your book?
It's a good question. I think, collinsauthors.com, all one word, collinsauthors.com. It has all the links to all of the socials that Courtney has put together. The list of little icons is quite extensive. So ultimately reach out in the way that, they're most comfortable with. I think the only one that we'd be pretty, like, we could miss, I think, if you tried to reach out to us, would probably be either Twitter, and I refuse to call it anything but Twitter. We basically have left there. So we have absolutely no presence there other than our name, just so someone doesn't steal it. And I would say Facebook is the other one that we just don't use all that often.
collinsauthors.com is our website. Please go to our website, because I had a meltdown like a literal child. I had that meltdown in trying to put together this WordPress word site. And by God, we got there because Clarke was able to make it happen. Thank you, sir. So please go to our website, and then you can follow us anywhere from there.
That's awesome. Cool. Is there anything else that you want to talk about while we have some time on the podcast, or anything you want to say in closing?
I just want to say one thing, which is that I want to say thank you, Glenn, for inviting us onto your podcast. I've been looking forward to this. for the past month or so, and it's a real pleasure to connect with you this way and to have a face to the name, because you and I connected over on Threads first, I think, and we're on IG now. And I see you really working for authors. I see you doing that. And I want to say that I think your success is because people appreciate and value you so strongly, as do myself and Clark. So really, thank you for what you're doing and how you're putting your time and energy out there for other folks. And if you need someone to host you when you need to have an interview for your stories, let me know, because I will have my ring light ready to do that with you.
That's awesome. No, I appreciate that, and yeah, I'm certainly doing what I can, because as a fellow writer author, I feel for other creatives in the space, and especially what's going on in the States, which that's a whole other topic. But I feel like there's stuff going on in the world that there's something I can do about it. So I'm going to do what I can. So I appreciate that. But yeah, no, thanks for coming on. I love the dynamic here, and between the both of you, and it's apparent in the book that you've been able to work well together, because you put out a solid book, and you've obviously gotten a good deal of traction on social media. Yeah, and just want to thank you for taking the time, and I'll put links to the things you mentioned and a few extras that you didn't in the description, so people can find your book. And if at this point, if you're still listening, you're not convinced to read the book, just go read it. It's a good read, especially if if you're into fantasy, if you're into Tolkien. I definitely would recommend it. So yeah, we'll call it there, and hope everyone has a good rest of your day.